Can you please take a seat? You should, Soltanieh, you should come with us. Sorry. Take a seat, yeah, take a seat, Annie. Yeah. No, that's okay. Sit here, sit there. I invited him too. So. Ambassador Soltanieh. Maybe in the end, okay. Thank you for this last morning of our conference. It's an honor and a pleasure for me to give the floor to the Deputy Foreign Minister of Russia, Sergey Ryabkov, who is a good friend of Pugwash. I was going to say good old friend of Pugwash, but he's much younger than me. So I didn't want to be misunderstood. And it's really a great pleasure. We wanted him to, at the beginning, to tell more about Russian and U.S. relations, but maybe we are now concentrating a little bit more in one aspect of Russian-U.S. relations, which is exactly the Iran nuclear deal. And we have then comments by Peter Jenkins from UK and two distinguished Iranian experts, Ambassador Soltanieh and Nasser Hadian. Thank you so much, and I give you the floor without any further delay to Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Professor Cotta-Ramusino, dear Paolo. Dear colleagues, friends, it's really an honor and a pleasure to be with you here for this occasion. I thank Pugwash for this invitation and also for constant interest in interacting with Russian officials. And over the years, we have developed a routine that in many ways enrich, at least I'm speaking for the Russian Foreign Service, enrich our thinking and our ability to broaden perspectives from which we address issues big and small. And one of the biggest issues of modern age was, of course, the development of the JCPOA that in so many ways set standards and moreover showed what was possible and what is possible in the modern diplomacy. And I think it's worth reminding of and recalling of, especially these days where many proven approaches are challenged and many quote-unquote new arrivals in terms of international policy, in terms of ways how to deal with things are out there, and we do not know yet how they will evolve and what it would mean for the international system. Let me start by saying that we recognize Pugwash as a very extraordinary, as a very important, eminent, and I would say extraordinary forum, which always brings together outstanding scholars, scientists, diplomats, and politicians to discuss the most pressing issues of the world, both current and long-standing, in a very open, frank, at times provocative, always bold and open-minded manner. Of course, I would also thank and say this with particular warm feeling, the government of Kazakhstan, which hosts this event. And I'm especially glad in this regard that I was allowed to be invited here and to speak before this distinguished audience at the panel with so prominent scholars whose names are well known and whose names resound broadly in my country as well as in so many other places in the world. Let me also take a moment to mention that on our road to reach the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action on Iran and to reach this nuclear deal, we spent many days and nights, in fact, in the beautiful city of Almaty here in Kazakhstan. And once again, I would use this minute to thank the government of Kazakhstan and the political leadership of this country for everything which they have done to this end and on the way towards our common success. Kazakhstan and the Kazakhstan Foreign Service managed to assist all of us in so many ways in moving the process forward while preserving the neutrality as a host. But this is not all. Kazakhstan's contribution doesn't end here. Astana turned out to be the one who made possible and precipitated the operational status of the JCPOA, the so-called implementation day that happened on January 16, 2016. And I am thinking on Kazakhstan's action to provide a batch of natural uranium to Iran within the framework of the enriched uranium exchange deal. Russia itself participated in this operation by taking excess enriched uranium from Iran. And we can say for sure that this was a unique and unprecedented project that required intensive and rapid technical, diplomatic, and political efforts. Now, it's quite fashionable to say today that JCPOA belongs not only to the parties, but to the whole international community. I would say that Kazakhstan is among those who can claim primary responsibility for this agreement and for this achievement. This July, the JCPOA hit 2 years since its conclusion. In our view, this mechanism is working well, meeting its objectives and reaching its goals, at least in what concerns Iran's nuclear program. Tehran strictly abides by its obligations and commitments. This is something that is regularly confirmed by the International Atomic Energy Agency. Today, the Iranian nuclear program is the most monitored and inspected by the agency in the whole world. Of particular importance is, of course, the implementation in Iran of the additional protocol to its safeguards agreement with the agency. The combination of these measures, as well as additional transparency, monitoring, and verification procedures, provide the highest guarantee possible in the exclusively peaceful nature of Iran's nuclear efforts for all those who have doubts in this regard. This is our hope that the fact that Iran agreed to enhanced scrutiny of its nuclear program will make the agency to quickly arrive to the point when the so-called broader conclusion about the absence of undeclared nuclear material and activities in Iran can be issued. That will constitute the final international certification of the exclusively peaceful character of the Iranian nuclear program. After all, the main objective of the JCPOA was precisely to assist the agency in regaining this confidence. And there should be no question that after the confidence is restored, all measures, and I say it again, all measures of the JCPOA that go beyond the additional protocol should cease. It is equally important that the monitoring and verification mechanisms that were tailored for the JCPOA and are not implied in the IAEA safeguards agreements and additional protocols remain exclusively in the context of the JCPOA and do not constitute precedent. There is a special provision in this regard in the Asghar 2231, and this is paragraph 27, and we exercise particular vigilance so that this provision is not violated. Our general assessment is that everything is more or less stable in the nuclear part, quote unquote, of the JCPOA. Of course, there are issues and questions, some of them are difficult and contentious, but we try to resolve them within the context and within the framework of the JCPOA Joint Commission. We constantly encourage all partners to avoid any unilateral actions with regard to the JCPOA without the full consent of the whole Joint Commission. We are firmly against any interpretation, any toughening of the screws, let alone renegotiation or amendments of the JCPOA. The IAEA should also strictly abide by the mandate entrusted to it by the JCPOA and by Asghar 2231 and the relevant resolution of the IAEA Board of Governors. Any unilateral actions by any party involved will only undermine the sustainability of the JCPOA and the trust that we have been trying to achieve and pour into the activities of Joint Commission. Unfortunately, the so-called sanctions part of the JCPOA stands out as clearly underperformed. We take very seriously the concerns that our Iranian colleagues and friends voice regarding the slow pace of business coming back to Iran, or even the complete lack of this comeback. We share the view that lifting of sanctions, which is an integral part of the JCPOA, should mean also lifting of sanctions in its strictest meaning and should be implemented faithfully. We cannot say that this is the case today. We see blunt attempts by the US administration to stall and even discourage the return of the international business to Iran. We feel this ourselves in our daily interactions with Iranians and with other partners. It is done by intimidating the business community with enormous fines for dealing with Iran, blocking legal transactions in dollars in the US banks as part of the extraterritorial sanctions and due diligence, which is extreme vigilance policy on the part of some banks. This creates the atmosphere of uncertainty around the future of the JCPOA, and constant waves of new unilateral sanctions that hit not only Iran but third countries as well remind us that the future of JCPOA may be less certain than we all would wish. We also notice a general reluctance on the part of the US to perform the commitments under their own commitments under the JCPOA. The sanctions waivers that are supposed to pass through automatically every 90 days in practice are accompanied by contentious debates and belligerent rhetoric. We think that all of this constitutes a violation not only of the spirit but also of the letter of the JCPOA. It puts into question the overall ability of the United States to stick to the agreements it makes. Another provoking example is the recent legislation on sanctions against Russia, Iran and North Korea, conceived by the US Congress and signed into law by President Donald Trump. Taking into account the context of my statement, I will only mention the Iranian part of this legislation, which is a clear violation of the Asghar 2231. Let's take only one example of this law, the enforcement of arms embargoes section. It introduces unilateral sanctions, including those against third countries for cooperating with Iran in the military field. Of course, the UN Security Council Resolution 2231 provides for certain restrictions in this regard. The supply of arms and related material and services to Iran under the 7 categories of the UN Register of Conventional Arms is allowed under this resolution only with the prior consent by the Security Council. But we all agree, I believe, that this is not a blanket prohibition. It is not equal to a blanket prohibition as implied in the US legislation. Moreover, this special regime under the resolution is supposed to end on October 18th, 2020 sharp. And this is exactly 5 days after the so-called JCPOA adoption day. Meanwhile, the US measures are of unlimited duration. How it can be called if not a violation of the Asghar and not an attempt to put its national legislation above the international one, spreading its effect on the whole world? Unless this issue is promptly rectified, the situation with the JCPOA implementation risks a very quick deterioration. And it is quite easy to imagine all the setbacks for the international and regional peace and security, for the world trade and economic cooperation, as well as for multilateral diplomacy. Let me conclude by saying that Russia, on its part, will continue its efforts towards a sustainable implementation of the JCPOA and further broadening of cooperation with Iran. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Before giving, we have some comments. We hope to be quick. So we have maybe 5-7 minutes for each comment, and then we'll give the floor to the participants. We have first, I guess, Nasser Hadian from Iran. You want to do it's just a name. I listen to you. Yeah, yeah.
Thank you very much. And thanks a lot for the presentation of Minister Ryabkov, and that was a very detailed and good analysis of the JCPOA and the consequences. What I would like to do is basically discuss very quickly our analysis of what would happen in the US, and then what are our options. I guess US would pursue 3 paths, or one of the 3 paths. Number 1 would be if basically US continue to abide by the JCPOA's principles and commitment, genuinely and honestly, which I think that would be beneficial for everyone. That would be beneficial for the US, for Iran, for the international community, and we all benefit from that. Of course, by no means I'm arguing that, that would be a perfect, but still that would be the best alternative to all of us. It doesn't mean that we don't have any disputes on other issues. Surely we have, but still for this particular issue with JCPOA have been addressing. That's the best alternative we have. Number two is basically U.S. will announce it would abide by the JCPOA's principles and commitments and promises, but make it very difficult in practice, and they hope that Iran would finally withdraw from the JCPOA. The mechanism for doing that basically are as follows. I've discussed already 3 paths for this one. One is the Congress would pass different sanctions laws about Iran's behavior with the hope of Iran being convinced to withdraw. So that's what Congress would do. In fact, the law which was passed last month exactly basically follow what I said. In fact, they passed laws about Iran's destabilization behavior in the region, about the human rights, and about the missile program, or missiles program. Number 2 path is administration is going to be in charge of so-called strengthening and robust verification and inspection regimes and implementation of the JCPOA. Code word, in other words, they are going to find excuses to ask for inspection from military sites which are sensitive, and they hope that, Iran would not accept such a kind of inspections, and then Iran will be forced to withdraw. So that's a scenario number 2. And number 3 is basically what President Trump has announced, and that's basically he has asked for individual in the White House find Iran in the non-compliance in their report. In other words, he's not going to certify Iran's compliance, and that will be another path forward. Of course, there is a discussion and debate that, if he doesn't certify, then what would happen? Is it automatically that, sanctions will not be waived, or he does not have the authority, and that authority, if he doesn't certify, will be delegated to the Congress, and the Congress should decide whether they should waive the sanctions or not. But anyway, that's a legal question, but the objective and intention is basically not certifying and sort of withdrawal from the JCPOA directly if all doors are closed. So of course, for Iran, the best scenario would be number 1. And between number 2 and number 3, surely we would prefer the number 3. Because as Senator Corker mentioned very explicitly, very openly, very publicly, chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, he said that, if we withdraw, US is going to be the subject, an issue, not Iran. So we have to do something that Iran withdraw. Thus, Iran become the issue and a subject of debate and discussions. So if that is the intention, surely we would prefer scenario number 2, that US to become the issue, rather than, the scenario number 3. Because number 2 is the most difficult for us, is the worst for Iran. It means they are going to adopt policies, they are going to require things from Iran that Iran withdraw at the end of the day. But what are our options in Iran? As I said, we are debating 4 options in Iran. Number 1, as I said it in the working group, or option number 1 is basically retaliation. That would be a sort of reactive policy choice. If US withdraw, we are going to withdraw. That has been a deal. US has been a key player in that. If US withdraw, so we are going to withdraw. That's number 1. Option number 2 is basically, no, if the rest of international community is going to continue its adherence to the principles and rules of the JCPOA, we are going to do it. We are not going to increase, we are not going to decrease. Whatever we have been doing, we are going to do. That's option number 2 for Iran. Option number 3 is we reduce our commitments proportionally to US withdrawal and continue basically the rest. Give you an example, the inspection would be a little bit reduced. For instance, the amount of enriched uranium we are going to have is going to increase from 300 kilograms, so forth and so on. These are the details. So basically, option number 3 is reduction of our commitments proportionally to US withdrawals and continue. And the option number 4 is we increase our commitments to proving to the world that, we are a very responsible player. We are going to increase it if we are allowed to have 300 kilograms of enriched uranium. Why not having 200 kilograms? And letting more inspections, so forth and so on. So these are the 4 scenarios, or 4 options in front of us in reaction to the US. Personally, I prefer sort of a combination of number 2 and number 3, not the number 1, a reactive policy, and not number 4, basically, which is the increase of our commitment. So it all depends then what would happen. So these are our choices, and these are all options in Iran that we are debating. And let's hope US seriously would adopt number 1 option in the front, which is a genuine, honest implementation of the JCPOA, and does not try to sabotage the deal because of the promises which President Trump has made in the campaign. As I said it in the working group, personally, I doubt he has even looked at the JCPOA. Forget about reading the JCPOA. So that has been basically some promises, anti-Obamism, anything Obama, he hated, he opposed it. And this is another part, like the climate change, like Obamacare, like a number of other issues. Let's hope rationality will be dominant in the establishment, political establishment, and deep state in the US, and they would decide to follow up at the first one. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Hadian. Now let me invite Ambassador Jenkins to make your comment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chairman. I'd like to start by underlying the debt of gratitude that we all owe to the Russian delegation and to Minister Ryabkov in person for the contribution they made to bringing about a successful outcome to the JCPOA negotiation. They worked tirelessly to bridge gaps between Iran and the United States and contributed many constructive and creative ideas. To my mind, it's doubtful whether we would have an agreement had it not been for their efforts. And I think we must all take comfort now in the fact that the minister continues to be a participant as a senior official in the joint commission that oversees the implementation of the agreement. Having said that, I want to make 4 points. First, I want to draw attention to a lesson from an early phase of the protracted diplomatic process that led to the JCPOA. Back in 2003, senior members of the George W. Bush administration wanted to use Iran's safeguards non-compliance, which was not in doubt, to bring about regime change in Iran. Their plan was to get Iran referred as soon as possible to the UN Security Council, and then to get the Security Council to adopt a resolution approving the use of force against Iran. Actually, I suspect they would never have achieved, at least that's the second part of that plan. But as it happened, they were thwarted by the ministers of the UK, France and Germany, who agreed in Tehran in October 2003 that the file should not be sent to the Security Council in return for Iran adopting the additional protocol and granting total transparency to the inspectors of the Atomic Energy Agency. Unfortunately, the Europeans felt it necessary to compensate the Americans for that by undertaking to persuade Iran in the course of a negotiation to abandon their enrichment program. Had it not been for that commitment, I think it's quite likely that there would have been a deal back in 2005, as you heard briefly yesterday from Dr. El-Baradei. It's a deal that would have relied on exactly the same formula as the JCPOA, confidence buildings, restrictions and transparency from Iran until such time as the IEA was able to give assurances to the world that there were no undeclared nuclear activities or material in Iran. Had it been possible to cut a deal back in 2005, needless to say, it would have saved millions of Iranians from hardship and would have avoided the quite substantial economic costs that resulted from the sanctions that were progressively adopted against Iran between 2007 and 2012. The lesson, to my mind, from this is that non-proliferation concerns must be handled in a politically neutral manner, not relegated to playing a subordinate role in the pursuit of political vendettas. One must not play politics with international nuclear problems. There is too much at stake. Secondly, the United States and its main allies claimed to the very end of the process, as far as I know, that the NPT does not confer on non-nuclear weapon states like Iran a right to enrich. This was an awful example of politically motivated sophistry. It's true that the NPT does not explicitly grant to non-nuclear weapon states a right to enrich, but it does not need to do so because that right is a sovereign right. What's relevant in this context is the conditions that the NPT imposes on non-nuclear weapon states who wish to exercise that right. Sorry, I've lost my thread. The right way to limit the spread of dual-use technologies like enrichment is by highlighting the high cost of acquiring an enrichment capacity and the technical obstacles to producing fuel indigenously for foreign-supplied reactors, and by elaborating international fuel supply guarantees, such as the LEU Bank that some of you will be visiting later today. If a state nonetheless insists on acquiring an enrichment capability, then they must be encouraged to put in place the kind of transparency measures that Iran has granted to the IEA under the JCPOA. My third point is this: it is looking likely that Iran will need no persuasion to remain a party to the JCPOA as long as the EU, Russia and China remain parties. I would certainly urge our Iranian friends not to attach any importance to whatever position my government adopts if the United States decides to withdraw from the JCPOA. The Brexit referendum has created such perplexities for the British government that it can no longer be relied on for sound judgment, and that ministers may well see an interest in following whatever lead President Trump sets. The important thing anyway to bear in mind at all times is that the essential purpose of the JCPOA is to create time for Iran to demonstrate to the world, via the IAEA, that that its nuclear program is entirely peaceful, for it to build confidence in its peaceful nuclear intentions, and for it to restore to balance the trust deficit to which Secretary Muniz referred yesterday. All else is secondary. Also, although United States sanctions have been and no doubt will continue to inhibit trade with Iran by third parties and the flow of investment to Iran, their effect will surely diminish as ways are found of evading or obstructing the extraterritorial abuses of US legislators. Fourthly, and lastly, what worries me most these days is what will happen after 2029, when after 2029, when Iran will be free to deploy as many centrifuges, and by then it will have mastered some very advanced centrifuge technologies. It will be free to deploy as many centrifuges as it wishes. President Obama disappointed me by failing to use his last year in power to try and change US-American attitudes to Iran. So the average US politician remains as hostile to Iran as before, spurred on by an even more hostile Israeli government. Unless there is a sea change in American and Israeli attitudes, one can imagine them in 2029 reacting to an expansion of Natanz by proclaiming to the world that Natanz is a nuclear bomb factory, as they proclaimed in 2002. To make it less likely that the rest of the world will take such claims seriously, in the absence, of course, of any IAEA report lending weight or corroborating such claims, I hope that Russia, China, and Iran, maybe even the European Union, will start to talk about the possibility of resurrecting the idea of creating an international consortium to manage Natanz. If Natanz is managed by an international consortium and is a major supplier of low-enriched uranium to foreign producers, manufacturers of reactors and nuclear reactor fuel, and of course, if Iran remains fully transparent to the IAEA, cries of wolf from Washington and Jerusalem are likely to fall on deaf ears. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Jenkins. Now, Ambassador Soltanieh. I'm sorry, Soltanieh. Yeah, you have the floor. Sorry.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in the name of God, the most gracious and most merciful. I'm obliged to express appreciation for Pugwash, which I'm associated over 2 decades with excellent arrangement for open-minded discussions. And I want to express appreciation for the host for this meeting and previous attempts towards settlement of dispute through negotiation. And I want to, of course, express sincere appreciation for very eloquent review by His Excellency Minister Ryabkov about the situation that then I saved the time. I will not elaborate some of the points that he is eloquently done so. Yesterday, I give 2 comments, but the thrust of that comments was we have to learn lessons from the past and not to repeat the mistakes or miscalculations. Dealing with Iran, since revolution, we have a list of the miscalculations by Western countries, particularly the United States. And on the nuclear issue, which have been involved for the 40 years, we have numerous of the miscalculations, if it is not ill intentions. They didn't expect that Iran will be able to be master of enrichment technology. That was a mistake. They thought by pressures, Iran will hastily withdraw from NPT. We didn't do it. Then surprised Washington, because they made miscalculations. They wanted Iran to do it, paved the way for harder, harsh actions, even military actions or whatever. But not because of that. We were committed to it. Iran is the only country has gone far that no country in the world has done so to bring the weapon of mass destruction, including nuclear, to become religiously seen, a fatwa, religious decree by Supreme Leader. According to Constitution, highest authority, therefore, is obligatory. And this is a message to the whole world. And we proved this commitment during imposed war by Saddam not using chemical weapons. Having said so, sometimes it doesn't harm if we would just make a diagnosis of what has happened in order to prevent the future events which might jeopardize the future peaceful relation between nations, including Iran with other world. My distinguished friends, Ambassador Jenkins, talk about EU3. In very simple, perhaps in 1 minute, that was a mistake. EU3 came to Iran, promised Iran that they're going to play the role of interlocutor, and Iran trusted them. We went that far to suspend enrichment, applying additional protocol which is not legally binding, applying 3.1 modified code. I was with the President Khatami when Mr. Al-Bradi came together, and he said, why don't you do it? We said, okay, we will do it as a good gesture. They promised that soon this issue will be settled down in the Board of Governors, and suspension is only short time, a matter of maybe months, weeks. It took 2.5 years. And it is interesting for you all to know that while we were suspending all these, and EU were cooperating with you and talking to them, they passed resolutions in United Nations, the Board of Governors of the IAEA. Who proposed those resolutions? EU3. Only one line, we appreciate Iran suspending enrichment and applying additional protocol, 2-3 pages of condemning Iran and expectation beyond whatever it is possible. And these old documents paved the way, sending this issue to United Nations Security Council. I refer all of you to go to the website of IAEA. I have brought explanations, including 5 legal reasons why the resolution of United Board of Governors sending this matter to UN Security Council had no legal basis. And nobody has challenged me since that year, 2011-12. Therefore, those resolutions had no legal basis. Therefore, we were not implementing. Therefore, the reason that they all came to negotiating table was the threat to the legitimacy of United Nations Security Council. That was the reason P5, all, particularly US, had no other choice. Did Iran come to negotiating table because of sanctions, pressures? Well, we were in negotiating since 2003. And every time we said, while we were working with the IAEA, which I was fully in charge and responsible for, we are open to remove any ambiguity through negotiation and talks. We have been always for negotiation, coming to Almaty here and there. Even we expanded EU3 to 5+1. As interesting, when we criticize EU3, why you were not able to deliver what you promised, they said because US is not on board. Now US is on board. Now we have JCPOA. Then this is the credibility of EU to safeguard this agreement for the future. Otherwise, nobody trusts EU too. Now, what are the serious threats to the JCPOA? I seek indulgence and please forgive me, the friends from US which are in this room. Some of them might even agree with me. The serious threat is anarchy in the hierarchy of United States. Since JCPOA entered into force and agreed, we don't know who is our counterpart in the United States. At that time, we didn't know is Mr. President Obama, the congressman, candidates, Ms. Hillary Clinton, Mr. Trump, and after Mr. Trump come to office, we don't know what's going on there. But in other countries, it is very clear. The establishment is there. While we had some of Iranians, despite of those that might have because of political confrontation, but many Iranians, intellectuals and parliamentarians, has serious, legitimate questions about the text of JCPOA. We have given too much concession, and I am of the belief that we have done so. But when following different procedure, democratic procedure, the parliament approved with some reservations and expectation, and finally the Supreme Leader endorsed it. Now we are not going to be more Catholic than Pope. And even all those opponents should respect this decision. And during the recent campaign of president, many forums that I was invited, I said, no matter who is the next president, whether President Rouhani will be elected or not, we will continue to be committed, because this is the commitment of establishment Islamic Republic of Iran. Is it the case in the United States? No. Every day we see rhetoric statements, and we are worried what's happening. And unfortunately, we were pushed to the case after this recent sanction, and of course, which is historical mistake. And of course, as it was clearly said, it is violation of the spirit and letter of JCPOA. And even Mr. Trump's talk discouraging others in G20 was also a violation of JCPOA. With these violations, the Parliament of Iran passed a bill. Maybe you have seen it. Of course, personally, and some people in Iran said, thanks to Mr. Trump that united all Iranians and all parliamentarians to have unanimous decision in this bill in Parliament. But from now on, we have to all exercise maximum vigilance to protect this agreement. In order to do that, US activities and in fact measures, of course, is a serious threat. Therefore, EU, Russia, and China, our friends, have to understand it. I appreciate very sincere, in fact, statement made by Minister Ryabkov that you understand our concern. Our patience has a limit. The lessons in 2003 to 2006 is important to bear in mind. We decided that we couldn't continue the suspension while we have problems continued, then we cannot go anywhere there. Therefore, it is not a warning, but of course, as long as all are committed to it, we will continue to be fully committed. But we hope that our other parties will understand us. I conclude by other points because the time is short and I want to answer questions if there are. The other point, which is the other issue which is threatening the JCPOA is Resolution 2231. This was a historical mistake, in my opinion. Because Iranians agreed that UN Security Council passed a resolution, they agreed during negotiation, in order to endorse JCPOA, future agreement, so that US will not withdraw or US will be fully committed or others will fully be committed. This is a guarantee. Therefore, we needed only one line resolution endorsing JCPOA and another line to eliminate previous resolutions. But look at the 2231. There are huge number, the Appendix B, there are a number of issues like conventional weapons, missiles, everything there. And whenever we test the missiles, which is not against any international regulations because there is no treaty banning any missiles, and of course we have to continue. This is very essential for Iran national security. Then they make a noise, make a fuss of it, and jeopardize JCPOA. If they wanted to do it, they could have a separate resolution on missiles, anything. They should not attach it to JCPOA. This was a historical mistake, I think, by all who proposed that resolution. These two are jeopardizing the future of this. Now, in a nutshell, I can say we have a lot of problems, concerns about what we have done in this JCPOA. And among those, I just give two examples which bother me a lot being in this business for years. Unfortunately, we have agreed in JCPOA one paragraph in preamble which says, satisfactory implementation of JCPOA will enable Iran to fully enjoy its right under the NPT, and after that will be treated like another NPT. I'm very upset about this paragraph. Not me, many intellectuals. Because Article 4 of NPT is clear, inalienable right. There's no question, as Ambassador Jenkins said, I disagree with him. NPT is very clear. There is no restriction whatsoever for enrichment, even the level of enrichment. But of course, it should be under the full scope safeguard of IAEA, that's it. Second point, which I am very disturbed, it says that these all restrictions only apply to Iran and it should not be applied to any other country or precedents in the international norms. It means that Iran is exception to the rule, and Iran should be treated differently. It is bad for Iran. And then I conclude by it. I appreciate your attention, Mr. Chairman. I noticed that you're writing a note to warn me. Therefore, I'm looking at you. I thank you for your attention, and may God bless you all. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Soltanieh. I would like to thank all the four speakers for their good management of the time. Now we open the floor for the audience to ask questions and make comments. Because we have a lot of items arrangement today, and this is the last day, I'm asked to conclude this session in time at any cost. So please make your comment and the questions short. So I would like to collect 4 questions from here, and then I would invite, that would be the second group. Yeah, and then I will ask the speakers to respond. Yeah, please. Yeah, the 4 gentlemen here.
Francesco Lenci from Italy, Pugwash Council. A question. You think that the European Union can play a good role, as we all wish, in protecting the JCPOA?
Sverre Lodgaard from Norway. Let me pick up on that. I believe that as long as Iran sticks to the agreement, the European Union would do the same. And I say so in reference to negotiating history, the Union's major role in it. I keep in mind also the interests in economic cooperation between Iran and Europe. However, I fail to see that the Union has done very much to protect its businesses against the eventual reimposition of sanctions, and to make its banking system less vulnerable and more forward-leaning in support of economic cooperation with Iran. So some doubts remain. And the measures I mentioned would have been important also to deter the United States from withdrawing. I would therefore ask you to comment on what we can expect from the European Union in this respect. What is the role of the Union in case the United States withdraws? And in particular, what can we expect of the UK? I think that is a bit more open to question.
Cliff Cubsha, and I'm from the Axis of Evil. A similar question. So we're going to see, in 6 weeks, we might see the U.S. withdraw. I think the chances are pretty good. 6 weeks, it's not very long. And Dr. Salehi said that Iran's going to stay in. But again, this isn't really about the EU, and it's not about the U.S. As I said in a previous discussion here, it's about markets and how markets are going to work. And is Total and Russian companies and Chinese companies and Peugeot and Renault really going to be willing to give up access to the U.S. market? Because that's what it really comes down to, is whether this is going to proceed or not. So, Sergey and Nasser, are there discussions going on to address what Sverre was talking about? Because you've got to, if you're going to make a JCPOA 2.0 work. How are you going to deal with how markets will react to the reality of reimposed U.S. secondary sanctions.
Carlo Trezza from Italy. My question goes in particular to Minister Ryabkov. He mentioned at the outset of his presentation that the JCPOA sets new standards. If he could elaborate on that, in particular on whether it sets new standards also for a new regulation of the international nuclear fuel cycle, and even if other members on the board wish to elaborate on that. Thank you.
Thank all the four gentlemen for your short questions and comments. Now, I will invite our speakers to respond. Ambassador Jenkins, why don't we start from your end?
Thank you, Chairman. I'm not in much doubt about the determination of the EU's High Representative to do all she can to preserve the JCPOA. She's made several statements over the last 9 months which give me that confidence that she fully appreciates the value of this agreement, fully appreciates Europe's interest, both non-proliferation, if you like, and economic, in preserving it. And I don't believe, from what I've read and heard, that she's facing any significant objections to that policy and that approach from the member states of the European Union. I entirely agree that it's disappointing that for some reason the European Commission has yet to come up with effective countermeasures to US secondary sanctions. I'm afraid I'm not enough of a lawyer. Well, I'm not a lawyer at all, so I don't know what could be done, but somehow or other common sense tells me that it ought to be possible to adopt European-wide legislation that does provide some degree of protection at least. The real problem, however, is, as another questioner pointed out, that many of the larger European companies do have significant American interests, and whatever the protection put in place against secondary sanctions, those companies will want to give very careful thought to those American interests before continuing to trade and invest in Iran. Nonetheless, I'm sure we can be confident that a company like Total has given very careful thought to all of that, and nonetheless has decided to go ahead and make a very major investment in Iran. So perhaps the situation is not altogether, the outlook is not altogether bleak. As for my own government, well, as I said, under the present management, this Conservative Party, which frankly has pursued a rather sycophantic policy towards President Trump's America, because it has an extraordinary faith in the benefits to the United Kingdom of a putative free preferential trade agreement with the United States. This would be the first ever preferential trade agreement in which the United States does other parties any favors, but nonetheless they pin their hopes on that because leaving the single market is going to cause extraordinary damage to our economy. And in those circumstances, they are, I fear, quite likely to decide to curry favor with President Trump by also withdrawing from the JCPOA. But as I said in my initial introduction, I don't think anyone else should pay the slightest attention to that. The reasons for it have nothing to do with the value of the JCPOA or with Iran's performance as a party to the JCPOA.
Mr. Ryabkov, please.
Thank you, Chairman. And I once again thank for the opportunity to speak before the audience. In terms of my comments to the questions which were posed, three things perhaps. Firstly, we are not in the process of developing a contingency plan for an eventual US withdrawal. We are focusing our efforts. We are using our channels. We are working at the Joint Commission and at political levels to an extent we can, so that to persuade the counterparts in the US government on the need to continuously certify for the Iranian compliance with the JCPOA and thus for continuous US compliance with the terms of this agreement where we see problems, but by all measure we do our utmost to present all the arguments against any changes of the treaty, not to mention, of course, this very deeply troubling and deeply disturbing hypothetical option of US not becoming party to the JCPOA. I'm not going to speculate on ifs. Nonetheless, I would say that any such development, for whatever reasons, on whoever might be the party to the JCPOA, would be a huge, huge blow to the international system, to the regional and global security, and Russia continuously stands very firmly on the position that JCPOA serves well everyone's interests, first and foremost the interests of Iran and the 3+3, P5+1, whatever you call, and it also creates a political anchor for the whole system of ensuring security from drifting away in an unruly manner. And this is an example of what can and should be done on the most difficult issues in a proactive manner, multilateralism being one of the bases of the Russian foreign policy. And we think, and I thank Ambassador Jenkins for his kind words of recognition of our modest input in all this, but for me it was by far more important to make sure that people around the negotiating table and others around really saw with their own eyes that it's not just pronunciations and empty words on the Russian part, that we may be able and willing to play within the team and, you know, make some good offices in a modest manner, whatever. And this is, again, brings me to an answer on golden standards. Golden standards not understood in a formal way, like some standards applied to the degree of intrusiveness of inspections and verification and everything, with all the importance everyone attaches to it. And also with a caveat that here we see a little of a problem, because all along during these negotiations at the table, we were pointing out that, with all due respect to the importance of this case, it should not be regarded as a precedent setting for different situations, because otherwise we will, you know, inflict a blow, if you wish, to the well-functioning system of agreements and additional protocols which individual countries and non-nuclear weapon states conclude with the IAEA and so on and so forth. It's a long story. Everyone in this room knows what it is about. So the golden standard of goodwill and compromise, a good standard of less ambiguity than usually is the case in this type of international agreements. And finally, a word on EU. That's not my business altogether, but I know for sure that earlier in time, the European Union found ways how to develop so-called legal antidotes against, to use the word again of Ambassador Jenkins, extraterritorial abuses of some US lawmakers. And that was in the case and in the situation of Helms-Burton legislation on Cuba, where upon development of these legal antidotes, the EU and the US were able to achieve an arrangement which was mutually satisfactory one, but essentially was something that punctured those early attempts of, well, at that time they were not early attempts, but long-standing attempts already by the US to introduce full and complete trade embargo on Cuba. So examples are there. I'll stop here, otherwise I will be misinterpreted. Thank you.
Yeah. Professor Hadian, please.
Thank you. Regarding the question which Sphere and Cliff asked about what Europeans can do, I guess two major things Europeans can do. One is basically send a message to Washington, particularly US Congress, that you're all better off to continue honestly and with a goodwill to continue to abide by the JCPOA, applying pressure there. But in case of not certification and not waiving or withdrawing from the JCPOA, I guess if Europe basically abide by its rules and its commitment, I guess particularly persuading the banks and the others to participate, I guess, I mean, for an important segment of Iranian society is very important. We are going to be in a position, we are going to be empowered to argue for continuation. Otherwise, basically, if Europe or EU basically does not support the JCPOA with the action, that people like myself will be in a very weak position to argue for continuation. So that's how Europe can be important. But as Minister Ryabkov and Ambassador Jenkins mentioned, you know, before the UN Security Council resolutions, basically a number of times US attempted to pass this extraterritorial sanctions law, but with no success. If you remember, under President Clinton, same thing happens, but Europe stood strong against it, and they had to withdraw or use waiver. So the same thing can happen. In other words, finally the world should make a decision that, I mean, are they going to subject their own sovereignty to the domestic politics of the US? Because they are sitting in the Congress because of whatever reason they are passing legislation and imposing on the rest of the international community. So I guess US is in a good position to argue against it and take the issue, take the matters to WTO, and I guess you are in a position to stop it. And we have done many bad things in our history, particularly since the revolution, but one of the worst things which we did on the former President Ahmadinejad was to teaching or helping to learn the Americans that they can exactly do what I said. They can pass extraterritorial sanctions and it can be implemented. But the point is, before that, we were not securitized, but under President Ahmadinejad, we were successfully securitized, and the indication of for that successful securitization, what UN resolution, UN Security Council resolutions, that's an indication to me. That's a good indicators of our successful securitization. And once we were securitized, then it was easy for Americans to pass these extraterritorial laws by reference to these resolutions, Security Council resolution, then they could impose. But now it is difficult to disassociate those time with the current time. At that time, because we were securitized, it was easy to do it. But they have learned, yes, they can sit in Washington, pass the laws, and the rest of the world are going to be obliged to follow what they pass. So this learning is going to be a very hard process to pursue. But if it happens, it's going to happen. That edifice of extraterritorial sanctions can collapse easily if, to me, if Europe, if EU stand against it, and the rest of international community show that you just cannot sit in Washington and pass the law against the others with no justification. If there is going to be international sanction, it should go through United Nations. Thank you.
Thank you. Ambassador Soltanieh.
Thank you very much. When this agreement was made, and there were a lot of oppositions from Republican, from some in the region, I said in some forums that I strongly believe that they are bluffing. They are very happy about this text because they know that never ever Iran will agree such a text. If you read it again, JCPOA, you know that these are historical concession and unprecedented restrictions, as partly also was reflected by Minister Ryabkov. I know that they are all happy about it. Even they celebrated behind the curtain when this agreement was made. But they just openly said, no, this is not enough. And when Mr. Trump said, I'm going to tear it out, I said he would never do that. Of course, despite of the fact that we have noticed unpredictability of this gentleman, but I still think that there is a wisdom. They know that this would happen. They talk about now renegotiation. First of all, I forgot to say at the beginning, everything I say is my personal opinion. I'm retired. Therefore, please, this is the position I have to say. They said renegotiation. I welcome if there is a renegotiation. Then I drop all those paragraphs which are unprecedented in the history. Now, the last point is, of course, what happens if such a scenario happens? Because of unpredictability, something might happen. This was a good question. Is EU3 or EU in general ready to compensate their mistakes during the previous phase of 2033 onward, that each time that we say, why you are not delivering your promise, said, well, I'm sorry, we are under pressure of US, we cannot do anything. So weak. Is EU now solid, strong enough to protect its credibility? Is EU and China and Russia ready to safeguard this treaty or this agreement at any price? Then we might not rule out that even if US out, let's do it ourselves and continue, and Iran might continue, as to show our goodwill to the whole world. Thank you.
Let me collect two questions. One in front, one in the back. Yeah, the gentleman, yeah. Okay, yes. Thank you.
Thank you. I had a question both for Mr. Ryabkov and Ambassador Jenkins. My question is directed to Mr. Ryabkov and Ambassador Jenkins. Your two countries are permanent members of the Security Council that adopted Resolution 2231. So if there is any detraction from the implementation of this resolution, what do you think are the implications for the Security Council? And what about the responsibilities of your two respective countries which voted in favor of this resolution to, in a sense, sanctify the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action? And I also wanted to mention that it's not a good thing to try and rewrite documented history, because if we look at the resolution that was adopted by the Board of Governors on the 24th of September 2005, it says, finds that Iran's many failures and breaches of its obligations to comply with its NPT Safeguards Agreement as detailed in the Director General's report constitute non-compliance in the context of the statute. It also says that the Director General's report reported the history of concealment of Iran's nuclear activities resulting in the loss of confidence. These are coming from the Director General's reports, independent IAEA findings, and in that case, the Board of Governors had no other option but to uphold the IAEA's technical findings. So we should not rewrite documented history here.
Thank you. Rakesh Sood from India. First of all, thank you very much for an excellent set of presentations. And I was particularly struck by Ambassador Soltanieh's opening remarks where he talked about miscalculations, and you said there was a miscalculation that Iran would walk out of the NPT. The US or the West miscalculated. Now, once again, perhaps we are at the risk of miscalculating, because even though the US has to, every 90 days, automatically renew the sanctions waiver, but we could very easily find ourselves in a situation where, let's say, theoretically speaking, the White House does not necessarily renew the waiver, but issues a notice that while it finds Iran in non-compliance, it is in the interests of everything else, at the moment, not changing the sanctions relief. But what it does is it gives a political signal that now this is what is going to happen. And at that stage, how will the other parties to the JCPOA respond to something like this? Because, and what then happens is that the scene of action moves to the Congress, which, as we know, is opposed to the JCPOA in a big way, and then it becomes open season for additional legislation. So how do the JCPOA supporters, I mean, how will they plan? How do they look at this kind of an eventuality?
Now I would like to invite the four speakers to answer the questions and to make your final remarks. Now, this time we begin with Ambassador Soltanieh, please.
Well, I have no comment on this. I prefer the other colleagues will say regarding the last question. Thank you.
I would like just to add one more point, that what EU can do is basically ask the Americans that both scenario number 2 and 3, option number 2 and 3 are wrong. In other words, there is a good chance they would adopt the scenario basically number 2, means pressuring Iran with the hope that Iran would withdraw. But anyway, that doesn't make that much difference in regard to the JCPOA. You have Europe and the rest of the EU 3 plus 3 have negotiated the deal, and we all have a stake in preserving it. It doesn't make that much sense either directly withdraw the way the President Trump wants, or indirectly forcing Iran to withdraw the way Senator Corker wants. Both of them are wrong, and that would be good if you send that message to Washington. We are better off to stick to our commitments in the JCPOA, and we are all be better off for that one. Thank you.
Mr. Ryabkov.
Thank you, Chairman. I think one of the interesting questions which still has no clear answer, or at least does not command a common understanding even among those who developed the JCPOA, is if this combination of the JCPOA and Resolution 2231 constitutes a piece of international law. I remember when I was making some points at an event in New York on January 16th this year, on the occasion on the first year of the JCPOA implementation day. There was a debate between the panelists and the audience to an extent that the extreme positions were presented, and the outgoing US administration, there were some people from the outgoing administration in the hall insisted adamantly that it is not a piece of international law whatsoever. I think not being a lawyer at all, like my colleague here, there are good arguments pro as well as contra in this case, and it's a vast field for suitable interpretations depending on what position in a given situation people take. That's obvious. For me, it's undeniable, though, that one cannot easily go away from this agreement through the unilateral action. You know, it's against the very logic and very concept of the document as such, and the mechanisms, such elaborate mechanisms and schemes, and you know, all sorts of models for behavior in a given situation that are set forth in the GCPOA for different developments. They kind of politically invite participants to think twice before they take some action that kind of rebalance this whole structure, or not to say on anything on a situation when someone goes away. So I think that the eventual repercussions from a legal perspective of such a hypothetical development should be studied and considered further, and I would invite scholars, and there are so many scholars with names that still pay attention to GCPOA and the future of GCPOA, to look into it with some degree of detail. I'm not sure I can say anything on what we expect or not expect, we nationally, from the US administration in this regard. I know for sure, though, that strictly speaking, and from the perspective which has been taken all along by people at the state and elsewhere who looked specifically and professionally into the substantial part of how GCPOA is being implemented, there were not that many questions. There are questions, of course, undeniably so, on what will happen with the, you know, the amount of heavy water after a certain period. Once again, who will buy, or if anyone will buy, the excess of this amount. There are issues on how to, you know, ensure that R&D on centrifuges and what is associated with this are interpreted in a unified manner by everyone at the Joint Commission. But those are technicalities. The political thing associated with the document in broad strokes relates mostly to a different views of countries on whether the Iranian missile launches are in compliance with the requirements of 2231. And what Ambassador Soltanieh said earlier on an eventual separate resolution on this issue, if it would work this way, I would tend to agree, but again, that was a part of an overall deal, of an overall package, and here we are. This is the reality which is around us. So I think that my short answer to some of the difficult questions would be we will make arguments with extra energy in favor of keeping this intact, and we will show why so, and why the contrary, you know, course of action would mean so many bad things, not just to GCPOA and our relation to Iran, but also to, you know, the practical sense of what is possible and what is not in the world of modern diplomacy. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. And thank you, Tariq, for reminding us of the precise wording of the IEA resolutions relating to Iranian safeguards non-compliance, not NPT non-compliance, but safeguards non-compliance. Since these are my final remarks, I hope, Chairman, you'll allow me to respond very briefly to what Ambassador Soltanieh said about the October 2003 Tehran agreement. I do not agree that it was a mistake, but I do think it was a classic diplomatic fudge. Let me explain why by telling you a very brief anecdote. When the parties to that agreement met for the first time after concluding it, it was in Vienna in January 2004. And although I hadn't been in Tehran or party to the talks that had led up to the agreement, I was there at the Vienna meeting, and for some reason the British political director asked me to open the meeting by making a short statement. So in my naivete, I said that I assumed the purpose of the agreement was to provide for Iran to suspend its enrichment, and there wasn't any reprocessing, it suspend its enrichment program until such time as the IEA completed its investigations under the additional protocol and gave assurances to the world about the absence of undeclared material and activities. I suddenly realized that everyone in the room was looking at me with consternation. So like any cautious diplomat, I beat a hasty retreat. It was only later that I realized where I'd blundered. As far as the Iranians were concerned, the prospect of having to suspend enrichment for 6, 7, 8 years, because it does take the IEA at least as long as that to complete additional protocol investigations, was anathema. And for the E3, the prospect that Iran might actually be able to resume enrichment after 6, 7, 8 years was equally unacceptable, because they were committed to persuading Iran during the negotiating process to give up enrichment. So the agreement was not a mistake, but it reflected a profound divergence of views and intentions. And as for the resolutions that we passed in the IEA board in 2004, we introduced those resolutions partly in order to block a path to the United States, who might otherwise have wanted to table much more hostile resolutions. And actually our resolutions were not nearly as hostile as Ambassador Soltanieh gave you the impression. They were designed to encourage Iran to expand the scope of enrichment, because at the outset of the period of suspension, Iran chose the narrowest possible definition of enrichment, whereas we thought we would feel more confident about what was happening there if Iran would accept a broader definition of enrichment. And in the end, in Paris, in November 2004, they did. Sorry for this little historical digression, but I wouldn't have wanted you all to go away with a misunderstanding of the events of what was quite an important period in what I described earlier as a protracted diplomatic process. Thank you.
Ambassador Soltanieh, please.
Well, I prefer them to say something so that I can really have a chance to say. I just want to correct what it was said with due respect. Based on what my dear friend Ryabkov read and Ambassador Jenkins, I encourage all to read Article 12C of a statute again and again. It says very clearly, the responsibility of recognizing non-compliance is the inspectors, because they have access to all confidential information, everything, and inspect, to report to Director General, and Director General report to the diplomats in the Board of Governors. Then they say that it is non-compliance. This procedure has not happened for Iran. These are one of those 5 legal reasons I said. Those resolutions had no legal basis at all. Second point, whenever there is a denial of access of inspectors, like North Korea, to that country, then this issue should go to Security Council. Iran, this had not happened. Every report of Director General Brady and Mr. Amano says IAEA is able to continue its verification, and even when I was in charge, even 1 second, the visa of the inspectors were not delayed. Third point, if there is evidence of diversion of nuclear material to military or prohibited purposes, then this should go to Security Council. All reports of IAEA you can see, more than 50 reports says there is no evidence of diversion of nuclear material to prohibited person in Iran. even until now. And the last point is interesting, I conclude. The EU3, it is interesting, in their resolution, before this matter go to New York, said one sentence: suspension is non-legally binding, confidence building, and for a confidence building measure. When it is non-legally binding, they declare themselves in the resolution, then we stop suspension after 2.5 years. We have not made any illegal matters. Therefore, this should not go to New York. Anyway, that is, I think, all. And for the heavy water, please bear in mind, heavy water is not under NPT safeguard. Whoever voluntarily applied additional protocol then said heavy water. Heavy water has no use. For a couple of liters heavy water, they make fuss in Washington and they want to apply sanctions. Thank you.
Just,
I didn't know you said 1 minute. But I thought you said
sorry, I think just before leaving the floor to our colleague Libin to foreclosure, I would like to remind that Pugwash has been involved with the nuclear program of Iran since 2006. We have been working hard in order to support the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. In 2014, we started making communication and contact with the business community in order for them to support the staying on and the signature of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. And I want to assure everybody that we as Pugwash will continue to do so. We will continue to work now for the preservation of a Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. So this has been just an interesting, very much interesting discussion, but be sure that we'll continue on that. And we'll try to do our all possible work to do what Minister Ryabkov just said.
The panel discussion has been very frank and constructive. I would like to invite our audience to join me in thanking all the 4 speakers and my co-chair. Thank you very much. Thank you.